Welcome to Chapter 13. We're discussing this week the thought and culture of the early 19th century. We talked in the last chapter about the Industrial Revolution. We've also talked a little about the Scientific Revolution. And so with those things, with science and with the development of industry, society began to look at things a different way, what was lacking. We know that in the Industrial Revolution, people started pointing out some problems, the lack of humanitarianism. So we have this period that follows science and industrial revolutions that introduces something new called Romanticism. And that's when they exalted imagination and feelings. The main idea of the Romantics was that imagination and emotions were also valuable, and that they should determine and form content of artistic creation rather than focusing on science. It was about how you feel. So we go from very sciencey to very emotional kind of outlooks. This outlook very much contradicted the Enlightenment rationalism. Like I said, it kind of threw science to the wayside and started focusing on emotions. The Romantics claimed the philosophes had turned humans into soulless thinking machines, that their sole purpose was for science. And the Romantics taught that people must be freed from all of this excessive thinking. You didn't have to intellectualize everything. It was okay just to feel. They also were convinced that textbook rules did not teach people how to create poetry or art. So if you've studied any art, you've probably heard of Fibonacci. If you haven't heard of Fibonacci by name, you may know the rule of three. It's this design principle that kind of breaks down the idea of an appropriate design into three different sections, and how you can use a major section in order to create a focal point, or you can combine minor sections of these thirds in order to do that. So Romantics, though, believed that even art should come from the soul. This artistic image of a traveler looking over a sea of fog really demonstrates the romantic look of this era that we're talking about in terms of art. Now, obviously, because Romanticism focused on individualism, each individual artist would have looked different, but they did kind of have these same ideas where the images were kind of soft looking, kind of fuzzy, if you will. The clouds are soft and wispy, the fog is wispy. You see a few straight lines, but most of the lines are even soft. And so this image in particular, with this person looking out over the mountains and into the fog, it kind of creates this feeling of mystery, this feeling of maybe discontent or wonder. So those are all things, those are emotions that artists would have tried to convey during this period through their art. As I mentioned before, the Romantics rejected the philosophes' idea that nature was some sort of lifeless machine. They believed that nature was alive and fused with God's presence. Basically, that God was in every aspect of nature, whether it's human being or wildlife, grass, air, whatever. Religion was a passionate expression of human nature to the Romantics. These people revered the Middle Ages for their spiritual sensitivity, also for the Christian mysteries and heroic deeds and social harmony. The Romantics considered each historical period a unique entity with its own soul. So when I say today history is alive, what I mean is that everything you do today will become part of history tomorrow. They meant history is alive as though it has its own soul. And they insisted on examining specifics of history within context of the times, which is now the foundation of what we do today. So that is still a very real part of our history. It's our goal to examine the past based on the context of those times in the past. It's really hard as a modern person to look back at the past and to remove our modern understandings from it. You know, it's the saying, hindsight is 20/20. We know things today that people in the past didn't have access to that knowledge, so sometimes it's really hard for us to get past that because we do have that knowledge. Sometimes you have to kind of remove yourself from today to put yourself back to remember things in context. One example in that is, let's say, in U.S. history, we've been recently talking about Pocahontas, and you know, the version that Disney tells versus the version that history can actually record. And so those two things are very different. And sometimes it's hard for us to get past our modern knowledge of the Disney movie to understand the basics of only what history can prove. Romantics regarded legends like the Pocahontas story, myths, folk traditions, and those sorts of things as a spiritual source of cultural vitality. They also used those legends to create a cultural identity. And romantics influenced the shape of modern nationalism. Nationalism, remember, is when we create a national image in order to create a national culture. Nationalism is sometimes seen as propaganda, and nationalism and patriotism are very, very often confused. If we haven't talked about that yet in this class, we will as we continue going on. A lot of times we think that folk traditions create patriotism. A lot of times, however, they actually create nationalism, which is not a good thing. Nationalism excludes people. Patriotism is kind of inclusive. Nationalism is exclusive. So keep that in mind as we continue discussing things this semester. This is another example of art from the Romantic period. This one is by William Blake, and it's called Dante's Inferno, the Whirlwind of Lovers. And he totally rejected the artistic conventions of the past, and he let his religious and political beliefs be just as unique as his art. He spent his life trying to convey tormented inward visions. And this one, speaking of tormented, is from Dante's Divine Comedy. So if you've had to read that in one of your English classes, you know a little about the Divine Comedy and Dante's journey into hell, that sort of thing. So anyway, we see death here, we see life here, we see lots of people swirling here, lots of water. We also see a religious image. So anyway, really interesting stuff in Romantic art. There's always lots to see and decipher. The Romantics focused on creative abilities and shedding light on parts of human nature that had been overlooked and undervalued by philosophers of the past. They were among the first to attack the emerging industrial capitalism for subordinating humans to factory processes and to treating them as mere things, like people were just objects. They were warm bodies that were fulfilling a task in a factory. The Romantic movement spoke out against that. Again, I'll mention nationalism here. The Romantic movement was potentially dangerous because it did set the background for this extreme nationalism that would come out of the 20th century. The attack on reason undermined respect for rationalism from the Enlightenment. And it kind of set up this precondition for the rise of fascism, which also ties into nationalism. We'll learn more about that as the semester goes on. The idealization of national myths reawakened world-based views based on feelings, not reason. And these national myths also could be referred to today as a term that we know as fake news. We hear it a lot. The link between Romanticism and extreme nationalism culminated in the world wars of the 20th century, so World War I and World War II. So it wasn't just art that saw influence from the Romantic movement, poetry also started gaining ground. One of the leading Romantic poets was Lord Byron, who lived from 1788 to 1824. He created the Byronic hero, which was this lonely, mysterious figure. He had a very short life, but he had lots of travel and lots of experiences in that short period of time. One of his best loved and most widely studied poems is called She Walks in Beauty. And I think it's really popular because it was quoted in a movie called Dead Poets Society as an attempt to seduce a young woman. It kind of epitomizes the romantic poem in general. And they idealized a woman's beauty, and this first line from the poem makes that very clear. It says, "She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and in her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light." So I want to point out to you, when you're reading poems, especially romantic poems like this, they can be kind of sing-songy, which helps if you have to memorize them. She walks in beauty like this. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light. So you kind of get this rhythm, but when you read poetry, read by the punctuation marks instead. There's no punctuation at the end of that first line. So it should be read until you reach the next punctuation. So it should say, "She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light." So anyway, just wanted to point that out to you. It's one of those tips that I got in college that I always try to pass along. Maybe that'll help you out in one of your comp classes. One of the leading German challengers of this time period was Hume, who wrote A Treatise of Human Nature and Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In these, he cast doubt on the possibility of scientific certainty. He argued that science cannot demonstrate a necessary connection between cause and effect. He also said that we can't guarantee that a specific cause will produce a specific effect, because cause and effect are only something that the mind imposes based on sense perceptions. And so these ideas of radical empiricism undermine the foundation of science that had been revered before. Immanuel Kant criticized and debated Hume's empiricism. Kant said that the mind is not a blank slate passively receiving sense impressions, but instead the mind is an active instrument structuring, interpreting, and working as it goes along because of its inherent logic. Kant also said that cause and effect and other categories of mind allow attribution of certainty to scientific knowledge, that because we can reason, because the mind can reason, that it does reason. Kant gave primacy to knower instead of to the objects of knowledge. So he took the focus on the mind instead of all of the things that would be going into the mind. A fundamental principle of Kant is impossibility of knowing ultimate reality. Our knowledge is limited to phenomenon. Kant reaffirmed the validity of scientific law, but limited range of science and reason to phenomenal world. Hegel enters the scene to try to explain all reality and fundamental meaning of the universe and human history. Hegel said that ultimate reality is knowable to the human mind, and that the nature of the universal mind, or the absolute spirit, can be grasped by thought, and that absolute spirit is not static, but that it's constantly evolving. Hegel also said that history is the development of spirit in time, that truth unfolds and makes itself known to humankind in the human mind. All aspects of a period are so interconnected that the period has organic unity, a historical coherence. Hegel also said that spirit of time manifests itself by dialectic confrontation between theses. Dialectic means learning through discussion. So the spirit of time manifests itself by discussing between a thesis, an idea, and an antithesis or antithesis that's opposite of that notion. So you have this debate, basically, that as this debate works its way out, a clash of opposite ends in resolutions or in a synthesis until it becomes a thesis and the conflict occurs again. So pretty much life is a debate. Hegel also said that individual freedom relies on institutions that are rationally determined and organized, that the will of the individual must be in harmony with the needs of the community. Now, and we've talked about a few of these philosophers, German philosophers at this time period, and you've got to understand that for every philosopher who's trying to do good work, there are people who are going to interpret that same philosophy and use it for maybe a radical sense. And some of these people, some of Hegel's followers, were called young Hegelians, and they interpreted Hegel's theories in a very radical sense. They argued that contemporary Germany had not attained harmony between the individual and society. The most important young Hegelian was Karl Marx, who retained Hegel's principle that history contains an inner logic, that it is an intelligible process and involved in dialectical struggle, so debate. Conservatism grew out of a response to Romanticism, and the base of conservatism was the value of tradition. Now, they did have something in common with the Romantics. They did believe that the philosophes' idea that the human mind could transform society was arrogant and even wicked. They regarded revolutionaries as presumptuous men who severed links with traditions, and tradition was very important to the conservatives. So, especially in terms of French society, they felt like that break in tradition opened the door to anarchy and to terror. Conservatives also recognized the limitations of reason. They identified that human wickedness was the very core of human nature, that humans were guided by greed and desire, that sort of thing, and that only institutions, traditional institutions like the monarchy, the church, and the aristocracy could actually hold that evil in check. So those three institutions were very well revered among the conservatives. Again, monarchy, church, and aristocracy were the ones who traditionally had the leadership roles. So conservatism really based their focus on that because monarchy, church, and aristocracy could keep evil at bay. Again, conservatism focused on the value of tradition. So the liberal philosophy of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution was based on the individual. So you don't have a lot of tradition necessarily tied to an individual. But when you focus on a community, there is solid tradition that you can find there. So conservatives focused community as the source of tradition. Conservatives said that society was not a mechanical arrangement of individuals, but instead it was a living organism with ancient bonds. They said that individualism would actually endanger social stability, that people needed those community bonds in order to build a stronger community. They said that without Christianity, civilization would fall into anarchy. And they insisted that the guidance of education be in the hands of religious authorities because they felt like if education was Christian-based, that civilization would thrive. As I mentioned, conservatism focused on the value of tradition, and that tradition couldn't be based on an individual because an individual only had his or her own tradition. So for conservatives, tradition was based on the community, the bigger society. Liberalism, however, focused on the value of the individual. And the sources of liberalism in the 19th century were actually rooted in 17th century England, where the struggle for religious toleration established this principle of freedom of conscience. And the Glorious Revolution of 1688 limited the power of monarchy. So when we say the Glorious Revolution, what we're actually talking about, sometimes it's known as the Revolution of 1688 or the Bloodless Revolution, but we're talking about the revolution in England that took place from 1688 to 1689. And it involved the overthrow of Catholic King James II, who was replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. So William and Mary came into power, replacing her father, King James II. They replaced Catholicism with Protestantism. The motives of this revolution, as you can imagine, were really complex and included political and religious concerns. But ultimately, this revolution changed how England was governed and actually gave Parliament more power over the monarchy and starts planting the seeds for the kind of political democracy idea. French philosophers helped to shape liberalism, supporting religious toleration, freedom of thought, the capacity of the human to reform society, and this whole new idea. Remember, conservatives believed that humanity was basically bad and needed to be kept in check, where liberals now are thinking that humans are essentially good. And it's this kind of thought that is essential to the American and French revolutions, and they are very crucial in the development of liberalism as a concept. Liberalism is the forerunner to democracy, even though the idea of democracy wasn't exactly popular at this time period. So we know that liberals of the era valued the individual, but many of the bourgeoisie liberals were really horrified that they would share political power with all people. So the bourgeoisie at the time would have been the middle class. They didn't want to share that power with those who were below them socioeconomically. So they wanted to concentrate the power in the hands of people that they thought were safe and reliable, which would be the property-owning middle class. They wanted to set property-owning requirements in order for people to vote or hold office. So liberalism was the philosophy at the time. However, the democracy idea that it brought about did not jive well with the bourgeoisie middle class. By the early 20th century, many European states had introduced universal suffrage. Again, suffrage is simply the right to vote. So by the early 20th century, many European states gave everyone the right to vote, including abandoning property requirements for office holding. They also improved conditions for workers. In the 20th century, some European countries gave support to demagogues, which were powerful dictator leaders who appealed to people's emotions, who promised swift and decisive action. Nationalism refers to the sacredness of the nation, and it's very often confused with patriotism. I can't say that enough. Nationalism and patriotism are two very different things, although we tend to think of people who are patriotic thinking highly of their country or nation. I'll explain a little more about that. But these components of modern nationalism actually start emerging at the time of the French Revolution. And the Romantics were the earliest apostles of German nationalism. They thought that the monarchy and aristocracy were vital links to the nation's past. These people believed that the nation was more important than the individual. And radical German nationalists argued that the national identity was an inherited characteristic that relied upon blood instead of acculturalization. Some German nationalists claimed that Jews could never truly be German, no matter how many generations of them had lived in Germany. So, we're talking here now in the 19th century, so we're still in the 1800s as this thought is developing. And you can see that this kind of thinking will lead us into some terrible times later on with World War I and World War II. Now, early in the 1800s, liberals were the primary leaders and supporters of these nationalist movements. They called for unification of Germany, Italy, the rebirth of Poland, the liberation of Greece from Turkish rule, and autonomy for Hungarians from the Austrian Empire. Liberal nationalists envisioned a Europe of independent states based on nationality and popular sovereignty. So, fewer big countries, lots more little states. Few intellectuals recognized the inherent dangers of nationalism or even understood the fundamental contradiction between liberalism and nationalism. The nationalist willingly subverted individual liberty for the sake of national grandeur. While liberals sought to protect the rights of all, nationalists ignored or even trampled the rights of individuals and minorities. And nationalists interpreted history to serve political ends. The love of nation threatened to extinguish liberal ideals. And that's the thing about nationalism. I mentioned before that nationalism is exclusive. And the fact that they ignored or trampled on the rights of individuals and minorities, those people were excluded.